Just over 100 years ago, Walter Rauschenbusch was a key Baptist figure and an influencer in the church at large in America as he challenged people to consider that the gospel was more than just about personal salvation. The gospel was meant to be transformative of the culture and the institutions that shaped and defined the culture. He saw himself first and foremost as a pastor and evangelist, though he is most thought of as a theologian and persuasive advocate of the social gospel. His writings and influence have been felt well beyond his life into the current day. This biographical sketch will give a sense of his life journey, touching on some of the experiences and people who influenced his thinking. Then, more importantly, it will identify how his influence has continued in different ways through the past 100 years, right up until this day and age. So I'm standing outside of Kerr Street Mission here in Oakville, and I'm using this as a backdrop for today's presentation on Walter Rauschenbusch, because this ministry, this community-based ministry, is actually based out of a Baptist church, Chartwell Baptist Church here in Oakville, and it continues to really serve the under-resourced people in this community. And I think it's kind of a physical expression of the social gospel, which was Walter Rauschenbusch's main influence, not only in the Baptist church, but also in churches throughout around the world. Walter Rauschenbusch was the son of the German immigrant August Rauschenbusch, who was a former Lutheran turned Baptist minister. Rauschenbusch's Christian experience was strongly influenced by his father and mother's pietist background. He experienced a spiritual awakening which led to his salvation and his baptism at the age of 17. His education included grade school in America, and then he continued with his education in Germany with what we would consider a university prep school. Upon his return to America, he continued his studies at the University of Rochester and the Rochester Theological Seminary, where his father was on the faculty. As mentioned, his pietist upbringing was influential in his continuing to foster a meaningful experience with God. And during his university years, there was another experience spiritually that inspired him to resolve to live entirely by the Spirit and teaching of Christ. And this determination led him to answer the call to pursue vocational ministry as a pastor. Upon completion of seminary in 1886, Rauschenbusch was invited to pastor the Second German Baptist Church in New York City. This church was located in a very tough part of New York City in the West Side, and it was known as Hell's Kitchen. His plan was to go there to preach and to pastor, to lead people to salvation and nurture them in their faith. But the more he encountered the great needs and the distress in his community, the more he sought for ways to address this great need. And the experience of working with the largely immigrant population that was impoverished, crowded in slum tenements, and taken advantage of by those of the wealthier classes led him to begin to see Christian socialism as a cure for economic injustice. He still believed in the experience of accepting Christ and finding strength in that relationship. But the economic and political injustice was ruining families. Through cultivating relationships with other like-minded pastors, a brotherhood of the kingdom was formed where books were read and intellectual discussion was had, seeking to understand a fresh identity for the church, an identity that reflected the kingdom of God here on earth. And many of those ideas were articulated by various liberal theologians who emphasized Jesus' message of the kingdom of God, the rule of God among people. A kingdom that did not imply merely salvation of individuals, but rather a social redemption as well. And this was a key idea that became a foundation for Rauschenbusch's theology. He argued that salvation was twofold, both individual and social. Jesus was a radical revolutionary who challenged the religion of the day. And likewise, he thought that Christians should not be afraid to follow the example of Jesus. The Church of Rauschenbusch's day had lost sight of the original intent of Jesus, that included salvation for the individual and the society. The message that he developed and articulated was fully expressed in his book, Christianity and the Social Crisis. In essence, this was a call to the church to adopt a social gospel. The idea of a social gospel had existed before. However, Rauschenbusch's persuasive writing made him an influential advocate that impacted the church of his day and way beyond. Certainly, liberal theological influences and ideas caused those in more conservative circles to be critical and unreceptive to his position. However, it did create an awakening and an awareness in the Protestant church which continued well after his passing away in 1918. Bill Pitts, in an article entitled A Centennial Legacy, notes a number of key people who he influenced in the different eras over the past 100 years. It's helpful to summarize this influence of Rauschenbusch as it bears directly on his continuing influence today. After his passing away after a brief battle with cancer in 1918, the social gospel message of Rauschenbusch persisted as it was adopted as curriculum in major North American seminaries. His books, letters, and lectures were translated, keeping his message alive and causing it to grow. Pitts writes that Henry Van Dusen, the president of the American leading seminary, a liberal seminary, Union Theological, called Rauschenbusch the greatest single personal influence in the life and thought of the United States Church in the last 50 years, going on to compare him to men like Jonathan Edwards and Horace Bushnell. After 1935, it was an era of clarifying what role the social gospel had in the church at large, and there was a number of people who spoke into that. And I just want to note one notable Canadian who was influenced in this time by Rauschenbusch's writing, and that was the Baptist minister Tommy Douglas. He was influenced so much that he switched from ministry to politics, seeing that as a means to proactively work towards societal transformation. When he was elected as Saskatchewan's premier, he was able to establish health insurance for all of Saskatchewan's citizens, and this became the template of universal health care that we have in Canada. In the 60s, there was a point of contention that was noted in that Rauschenbusch was criticized for not doing or saying enough to help women, and particularly for not saying enough to help people of color coming from the slave culture of the South. There's no doubt his attitude to women was patriarchal, though he welcomed the movement toward women being allowed to vote. In regards to the suffering African Americans, he was keenly aware of it and condemned it. However, he confessed he had no solution to the problems faced by that community. His focus was very much on the issues, the injustices in New York City. Even so, his writings influenced those like Martin Luther King Jr., who expressed his indebtedness to Rauschenbusch and his influence through the reading of Christianity in the Social Crisis. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Reading this book left an indelible imprint on my thinking." After 1990, Pitt notes that even since year 2000, there has been an increase in interest in Rauschenbusch, and this interest has come increasingly from evangelicals. There's a growing interest among both conservative and liberal backgrounded believers who are committed to social activism and ministry, people who want to be involved in creating a better society. Writers, pastors, and church leaders continue to draw on Rauschenbusch's call to follow the example of Christ and engage society to work towards transformation along the lines of seeing God's kingdom established. Rauschenbusch is remembered as a theologian and a Baptist minister. Though, as he expressed his thoughts to his closest confidants, his desire was first and foremost to pastor people, to pastor them in the way of Christ and to see them evangelized as they experienced the help that they needed. He had the greatest impact and continuing legacy in his call for justice in human relationships, and this flows out of his initial call to be a pastor. He sought to help people sort through the issues of their relationships, working towards justice. Even in the community where I live, here in Oakville, through Kerr Street Mission, and the community where I serve, where we seek to not only experience transformation, but work towards transformation for the glory of God, we see the impact of the call to move beyond a personal experience of Christ to see the community transformed by Christ as well. And for this legacy, I am appreciative of the contribution of Walter Rauschenbusch.